The electric vehicle boom has arrived, with Tesla shares soaring. Business is so good, in fact, that Tesla's growth is becoming its own constraint, with supply chain bottlenecks limiting the scale-up of production. Elon Musk has tweeted about nickel being his big concern. But why is it that Tesla is so concerned about nickel out of all the other commodities and components in their supply chain? After all, the market is in surplus, and production is growing at a pace that will likely keep up with demand from the EV sector. The existing capacity and projects under development for battery-grade nickel are sufficient for the projected demand. But the concern for Tesla is that all this growth is coming from just one place: Indonesia. Having all the EV eggs in one basket is not desirable for many reasons. Despite its excellent record in investment over the past decade, sovereign risk in Indonesia remains high, and the undercurrent of resource nationalism remains strong. The government has made several policy backflips over the years, and the investor-friendly Jokowi term ends in 2024. Many of Indonesia's most successful recent nickel projects have received tremendous support from the government. How much support will remain when the new government comes in remains to be seen. The other big concern for Tesla is the ESG risk in the nickel supply chain. Elon Musk, in his famous call for more nickel to be mined, didn't just ask for any nickel, but specifically asked for sustainably produced nickel. The rise of Tesla has come about because of an exponential growth in ESG awareness. This became most noticeable in 2020 and has continued unabated through 2021. The risk in nickel today has many similarities with the issues in the cobalt supply chain, which came to the fore a few years ago. In 2016, Amnesty International released a report that documented the use of child labor in the cobalt supply chain. This report, and the associated social media campaign, brought about a seismic shift in the way consumers viewed the battery supply chain. For the first time, consumers were able to draw a link between the batteries in their phones and the conditions in mines in Africa. The way Indonesia is set to dominate nickel supply is similar to the DRC's dominance in cobalt. And Tesla is acutely aware that its consumers are, by their very nature, highly attuned to environmental and social issues. Tesla knows it cannot afford to have any such controversy in its supply chain, as it would undermine the entire EV sales proposition. But there are some big differences in the issues between nickel and cobalt. Where cobalt faced human rights issues, in nickel the risk is more on environmental issues. One of the key concerns with the emerging nickel producers in Asia is the carbon emissions in nickel production. Indonesia's largest nickel-producing park has 2,500 megawatts of coal-fired power capacity. And this is just one of the many parks and plants now under development. All of these facilities currently use coal-fired power and have a significant carbon footprint. Waste is another key issue. Huge volumes of slag and tailings pose long-term liabilities for producers. Indonesia's HPAL projects are already ramping up, and the country will soon need to face the issues around HPAL waste management. There are three main ways that the HPAL tailings can be managed. The conventional approach is to use a tailings dam. However, these dams pose significant risk, especially in locations such as Indonesia. Rainfall in Indonesia is much higher than other nickel-producing regions. This adds complexity to tailings dam design and operation. Indonesia is also on the famous Ring of Fire and has a high seismic risk. The alternative method is deep-sea tailings placement. In the right setting, DSTP can often make sense from a purely technical perspective. However, public perception is strongly against submarine tailings placement, and it would be unlikely that a company like Tesla would want to receive nickel that is linked to this practice. The Indonesian nickel developments are also right in the middle of the famous Coral Triangle, which is recognized as a global priority for marine conservation. Dry stacking is probably the best way to handle the tailings. However, there are still some technical challenges with the dewatering process, and the dried stack still carries some geotechnical risk. The issues of carbon emissions and waste management are well known by all stakeholders in the nickel supply chain. But lurking below the surface are other ESG risks that are not so well known. Two key challenges are impacts to biodiversity and to water. Further upstream, the mines that feed the HPAL plants have the potential for severe environmental and social impact. Indonesia's nickel mining areas are located in the center of a region known as Wallacea, named after the famous naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace. The region has a remarkably high degree of endemism, with highly unique wildlife. Deforestation is required to access the nickel ore. Unfortunately, not all the nickel mining companies operating in Indonesia carry out the necessary rehabilitation and other safeguards to minimize impacts to biodiversity. With the mines located in the wet tropics, it is inevitable that deforestation also gives rise to high erosion potential. These two photographs were taken in the same location, one before a nickel mine was established and the other one afterwards. The erosion from the mine caused a total change in the aquatic environment. So what is being done to address these ESG risks? The practice of supply chain due diligence is now becoming well entrenched in the battery metals supply chain. Most companies require the use of a supply chain guideline that is in line with the OECD due diligence guidelines for minerals from conflict-affected and high-risk areas. But the OECD guidelines and the current codes from EV makers such as Tesla and VW do not cover the specific issues that affect nickel. There are specific guidelines for handling human rights issues that can be expected in the cobalt supply chain, but there is nothing about coal-fired power, nothing about expectations on tailings management, and nothing about deforestation and rehabilitation of mines. A blanket ban on Indonesian nickel would not be a viable solution. Indonesia has many responsible producers of nickel, including members of the Nickel Institute. An embargo on Indonesian nickel would result in a massive shortfall of nickel and pose a risk to the entire renewable energy transition. The solution is to develop proper due diligence guidelines and templates that address the specific ESG risks in the nickel supply chain. These guidelines should require transparency of energy sources and carbon emissions, waste volumes and disposal methods, rehabilitation of mined out areas, biodiversity impacts, and water monitoring. Through proper due diligence that targets the nickel-specific ESG risks, EV makers will have the comfort needed to continue down the path of high nickel volumes in EV batteries.